Imagine it is 1715. You are a sailor aboard a British Royal Navy vessel somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. The ship smells of rot and salt and unwashed bodies packed too close together for too many months. Your hammock is shared. Your food is weevil-ridden biscuit and salted beef that stopped resembling beef 3 months ago. You are not a criminal. You have committed no crime. You were pressed into service, meaning men with clubs showed up in a Portsmouth tavern one night and you woke up at sea. Your pay, when it comes at all, is 4 months late. And the man above you, your captain, has the legal authority to have you flogged to within an inch of your life for the offense of looking at him the wrong way. This is not a war. This is just a Tuesday. This is the world that every man who ended up in Nassau was trying to escape. Not the world of romance novels and Hollywood blockbusters, that world of shining swords and charming rogues sailing free. The actual world. The world of systematic, legally sanctioned exploitation dressed up in uniforms and flags and the language of patriotism. But then, a rumor. A whisper that moves through every dockside tavern from London to Lisbon to Port Royal. There is a place, a small island in the Bahamas called New Providence, and in its harbor something has happened that the great empires of the world do not have a word for yet, something that will not be given a proper name for another 60 years. 1,000 men and some women have done something that was supposed to be impossible. They have decided collectively that the rules no longer apply to them. Not just the laws, the entire architecture of the world they came from. The hierarchy, the obedience, the kings and captains and merchants who sat at the top of every structure they had ever lived inside. They have built a republic in the middle of the Caribbean, in 1715, without a king, without a parliament, without the permission of any power on earth. They elect their captains. They vote on their operations. They split their earnings according to a written contract that every man signs. And when you are injured in their service, they pay you compensation, something no navy, no merchant fleet, no legitimate employer of the era would dream of doing. These men are called pirates. The world calls them criminals. And that label, that word, is the most effective piece of propaganda in maritime history. Because if you call them criminals, you never have to take seriously what they actually built. And for 300 years, that has worked perfectly. Today, we are going to stop letting it work. Today, we are going to take Nassau seriously. Because when you strip away the treasure maps and the skull-end crossbones flags and the Hollywood mythology, when you actually sit with the historical record, with the pirate articles and the depositions and the Board of Trade reports and the trial transcripts, what you find underneath is something stranger and more significant than the legend. What you find is a community of people, most of them poor, most of them previously conscripted or indentured or enslaved by the very empires they were now robbing, who figured out how to govern themselves without a king, and who paid for that experiment with their lives when the empires decided the lesson could not be allowed to spread. This is the story of Nassau. This is the story of the Pirate Republic, and it is not a pirate story. It is a political story. It just wore a pirate story as a disguise. To understand what Nassau was, you have to understand the specific historical wreckage it was built from, and that wreckage begins with a war. The War of Spanish Succession ran from 1701 to 1713. For 12 years it consumed Europe, and it consumed the Caribbean in parallel. Because the Caribbean was not simply a tropical holiday destination, it was the engine of the entire Atlantic economy. Sugar, tobacco, silver, enslaved human beings. The wealth of the New World flowed through those sea lanes, and whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the money. To fight that war at sea, the British Crown did something that would have enormous consequences. They issued letters of marque. These were legal documents, royal licenses that authorized private sailors to attack enemy shipping. Spanish ships, French ships, fair game, not piracy, privateering. Legally sanctioned, crown-approved violence for profit, with the sailors keeping a share of whatever they captured. At the peak of the conflict, There were approximately 30,000 privateers operating in Atlantic waters. 30,000 men, many of them former naval sailors, some of them former slaves, many of them the poorest and most desperate men in the Atlantic world, who had been trained by the British Crown to do one thing: take ships by force. Then, in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. The war ended. The letters of marque expired, and 30,000 men with nowhere to go and no legal means of survival found themselves classified, overnight, as criminals for doing exactly what they had been trained, equipped, and encouraged to do. Think about what that actually means. One year you are a crown contractor. You attack a Spanish merchant vessel, and you are, technically, a servant of the King of England. The next year you attack the same vessel with the same crew on the same ship, and you are a pirate subject to death by hanging. Nothing changed except a piece of paper that someone in London decided to stop printing. The British Navy demobilized. The pay stopped. The ships were still out there, crewed by men who had spent a decade learning that violence at sea was profitable, and who now found that the line between privateer and pirate was not a moral distinction or even a practical one. It was an administrative one. Many of them went to Nassau, and the island was ready for them, in the specific way that a broken, abandoned, ungoverned piece of rock in the Bahamas is ready for men who need somewhere to disappear. The island of New Providence, where Nassau sat, had been devastated by Spanish and French raids in 1703 and 1706. The English colonial government had effectively collapsed. There was a fort, mostly rubble. There was a harbor, one of the best natural anchorages in the Caribbean, deep enough for large ships, shallow enough at the approaches to prevent naval vessels of the line from pursuing you inside. And there was nothing else. No governor, no garrison, no law. It was, in other words, a blank canvas, and the men who came to paint on it were not philosophers. They were sailors, hungry, experienced, and very, very angry at the world that had made them. Most people, when they think about pirate ships, imagine chaos, a floating anarchy of violence and rum and no rules whatsoever. And that image, that comfortable, Hollywood-approved image, is almost perfectly wrong. Pirate ships in Nassau's Golden Age were among the most thoroughly governed vessels in the Atlantic world. Not governed by a distant king or an appointed captain with absolute power, governed by the crew itself, through a document every single man signed before the ship left harbor. These were called the Articles, and they are the most remarkable political documents of the early 18th century that almost nobody has ever read. What made the Articles remarkable was not just what they said, though what they said was extraordinary, but what they assumed. They assumed that the men on the ship were capable of governing themselves, that they did not need someone above them to tell them what to do. That authority could flow upward from the crew rather than downward from a crown. Rule 1: every man gets a vote. Whether you were a former slave who had escaped a plantation, a disgraced naval officer, a Portuguese sailor who had jumped ship in Havana, or an English carpenter who had been pressed into the Navy at 18 in Nassau, your voice mattered equally. One man, one vote. The captain was elected. He could be removed. Major decisions about targets, routes, the division of spoils, these went to a vote of the full crew. This was not how any legitimate institution in 1715 operated. The British Navy ran on absolute hierarchy and brutal discipline. Merchant ships gave captains unchecked authority over crews who had no recourse and no rights. The political systems of England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, all were organized around the principle that authority descended from above, from God to king to aristocrat to merchant to everyone else. In Nassau, authority ascended from below. Rule 2: the quartermaster, the people's representative. The captain of a Nassau pirate ship had authority during combat, absolute authority. When the cannons were firing and the ships were engaged, you did not put things to a vote. Someone had to command, and everyone had to obey instantly or people died. But outside of combat, The captain was first among equals, and his power was specifically checked by a second elected officer, the quartermaster. The quartermaster, elected separately by the crew, accountable separately to the crew, controlled the distribution of goods. He managed disputes. He oversaw punishment. He was, in effect, a constitutional brake on the captain's authority. If the captain and the crew disagreed, the quartermaster was the mechanism through which that disagreement was resolved. Not through flogging, not through the captain simply doing whatever he wanted, through process. Think about what this meant in practice. A privateer sailor in 1712 had no recourse. If the captain decided to shortchange his wages, he had nowhere to appeal. If the captain decided to flog him for insubordination, he had no defense. The captain's word was law because the king's authority flowed through the captain, and neither could be questioned. On a Nassau ship, the quartermaster existed specifically to answer the question, who watches the captain? And the answer was, the crew through their elected representative. Rule 3. Compensation and the pirate insurance policy. This is the part of the Nassau story that almost nobody tells, and it is, in some ways, the most radical part of all. The pirate articles included what can only be described as a primitive workers' compensation system. Before a voyage began, the articles specified exactly what every man would receive if he was injured in the course of the crew's operations. Loss of the right arm in battle, 600 pieces of 8. Loss of the left arm, 500 pieces. Loss of the right leg, 500 pieces. Loss of the left leg, 400 pieces. Loss of an eye, 100 pieces. Loss of a finger, 100 pieces. These payments came out of a common fund set aside before the general division of captured cargo, and they were not charity. They were a contractual obligation. Every man who signed the articles was entitled to this compensation as a matter of written agreement, not as a favor from a generous captain, not as a discretionary payment, but as a right. Compare this to legitimate maritime employment of the same period. Merchant sailors were paid at the captain's discretion and received nothing for injuries. If you lost an arm loading cargo on a legitimate merchant vessel, you were discharged with whatever the captain felt like giving you, which was usually nothing, and left to survive on charity or begging. Naval sailors who were injured in the service of the Crown received pension payments that were chronically underfunded, delayed by years, and available only to those who could navigate the bureaucratic process of applying for them. A process designed by educated men for uneducated ones, and consequently navigated successfully by almost no one. The pirates of Nassau had solved this problem with 2 sentences in their articles. Lose a limb, receive a specific sum, no questions asked, no applications, no waiting. The Republic took care of its own because it understood what the Empire had never bothered to learn. A man who knows he will be cared for if he falls fights harder and more freely than a man who knows he will be discarded. Rule 4. The equal division of spoils. Nassau's economy was redistributive in a way that no legitimate economic system of the era came close to. Captured cargo came in and was divided according to the articles. The captain received 2 shares to a common sailor's 1, a premium for the skill, leadership risk, and responsibility of command, but not a dramatically larger share. The quartermaster received a share and a half. Specialist, the carpenter and surgeon, whose skills kept ships operational and crews alive, received additional compensation. And here is the number that matters. In legitimate maritime employment, the captain might receive 50 times the earnings of a common sailor. The merchant or shipowner who employed them might receive 100 times. The surplus value generated by the labor of 30 men flowed almost entirely to the people who had supplied the capital, the ship, and almost nothing to the people who had supplied the work. In Nassau, the ratio between the highest paid man and the lowest paid man on the same ship was approximately 2 to 1. In the most radical economic arrangement of the early 18th century, the gap between the top and the bottom was 2 shares versus 1 share. Not because Nassau had a theory of economic equality. It didn't, but because the men who wrote the articles had all spent their lives being the ones at the bottom, and had simply decided they didn't have to accept it anymore. Nassau did not become a republic by accident. It became one because specific men, with specific abilities, made specific decisions in a specific period of historical opportunity that lasted approximately 5 years. And the most important of those men in the founding period was Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold was English, a former privateer, by all accounts a genuinely talented sailor and commander, the kind of man who can read weather and tide and the intentions of other captains the way scholars read books. He was one of the founding figures of what historians would eventually call the Flying Gang, the loose confederation of captains who made Nassau their base from roughly 1713 onward. What is interesting about Hornigold in the early Nassau years is not just his skill but his principles, and the way those principles reveal both the idealism and the limitations of what Nassau was trying to be. In the early years, Hornigold operated under a peculiar self-imposed restriction. He would attack French ships. He would attack Spanish ships. He would attack Dutch ships. He would not attack English ships. This was not a legal obligation. Nassau had no law. It was a principle, held and enforced collectively by his crew, that carried with it the vestigial loyalty of men who had served the English crown and hadn't quite finished grieving the relationship. That principle would not survive contact with the full Nassau community, because Nassau attracted men from everywhere. English sailors certainly, but also French and Dutch and Portuguese. Men who had been enslaved and escaped. Men who had been transported to the colonies as indentured labor and completed their terms to find themselves free but penniless in a world that had no use for them. Men who had been born free in the Caribbean, in communities the colonial powers acknowledged only when they wanted something from them. These men did not share Hornigold's English loyalties, and in the democracy of Nassau, their votes counted equally. The principle of not attacking English ships died in a vote, as principles die in democracies when they no longer command majority support. Nassau at its peak, a genuine naval power. The Flying Gang grew through 1714 and 1715 and 1716. Nassau's population expanded and consolidated, absorbing arriving crews, integrating new ships, becoming something more organized and more formidable than a simple haven for outcasts. At its peak, Nassau's pirate community could put somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 armed men on ships simultaneously. Consider what that number means. No single colonial governor in the Caribbean commanded that much force. The combined naval presence of England in the region, during the years when London was focused on European affairs and hadn't yet recognized the scale of what was developing in the Bahamas, was barely larger. Nassau was, for a window of approximately 5 years, a genuine naval power, not a gang of outlaws. Not a criminal enterprise that could be cleaned up with a couple of frigates. A functioning military force that could project power across the Caribbean, that had its own intelligence network, its own supply chains, its own diplomatic relationships with sympathetic merchants in colonial ports who preferred to buy stolen goods quietly rather than pay full prices legitimately. The operations that launched from Nassau in this period were not the random opportunism of desperate men. They were coordinated, systematic, and increasingly sophisticated. Ships worked in concert. Information about convoy routes and cargo manifests circulated through the Nassau community. Captains who had competed as privateers now collaborated as something closer to a navy without a state. The cargo flowing back into Nassau was extraordinary. In 1716 alone, Nassau-based pirates captured goods worth an estimated several £100,000 sterling in contemporary value. Sugar, tobacco, manufactured goods, silver from Spanish shipments. The economic disruption to Atlantic trade was severe enough to reach the Board of Trade in London, whose reports from this period show an escalating alarm that goes beyond simple concern about stolen cargo. The question of slavery, Nassau's most contested legacy. Here is the part of the Nassau story that resists easy celebration, and it is important not to look away from it. The Pirate Republic was not an abolitionist movement. It did not arrive at a principled rejection of slavery as an institution. What it arrived at, in practice, was something messier and more interesting, and ultimately more revealing about what Nassau actually was. Black sailors served in Nassau crews in numbers completely unlike anything in legitimate maritime employment. Freed slaves served as full members, with full voting rights and full shares of captured cargo on many Nassau ships. Escaped slaves arrived in Nassau and were integrated into the community without being returned to their owners, not out of ideology, but out of the same practical logic that governed everything else in Nassau. You were useful. You signed the articles. You got a vote and a share. But Nassau also participated in the slave trade. Captured slave ships were sometimes freed. Their human cargo offered membership in the pirate community. Sometimes they were sold again. The deciding factor was not principle but circumstance, the captain's inclinations, the crew's vote, the available market. This ambiguity is not a comfortable footnote to the Nassau story. It is central to understanding what Nassau actually was, a radical experiment in collective self-governance that extended its principles of equality to everyone who signed the articles, and did not extend them to everyone else. Radical by the standards of 1715, profoundly inadequate by any standard we would want to apply today. Nassau was not utopia. It was the most equal society in the Atlantic world at that moment in time, which tells you something important about how much equality the legitimate world contained. Nassau ye history humin ek ac cheese dikati hi jo hum axar bul jot hain, ki chaos ki beach main by insan system banana chata hi, ki hierarchy zaruri na hi, ye surf ek choice hi, jo historically unlagan ni kai jo sab si u par they. Agar opko ac unsung stories passant hain, Jahan history surf dates or battles nahai bulky ideas or insan hain, to abhai rogue bilge subscribe Karen or bell icon dabhin. Humhar haft in stories ko bahar late hain. Or comment main mudge badhin, agar op 1715 main hot, to kaya op Nassau join cart. Ya pardon leak gar wappies jot, main niche wait karunga. Edward Teach arrived in Nassau sometime around 1716. He came under the wing of Benjamin Hornigold, who recognized talent the way experienced commanders always do, not by reputation, but by watching a man work. Hornigold gave him command of a captured sloop. Within a year, Teach had accumulated a small fleet and a reputation that exceeded anything the evidence of his actual crimes fully supports. He was operating as Blackbeard by 1717, and the mythology was already overtaking the man. Let us talk about the mythology first, because it is instructive. The burning fuses woven into his beard and hair before battle, the multiple pistols strapped across his chest, the way he is described in contemporary accounts as emerging from smoke and fire like a figure from hell itself. This is the image that has survived 300 years and become the defining visual of the entire Golden Age of Piracy. But here is what the historical record actually tells us about Edward Teach. He killed remarkably few people. He captured dozens of ships in major operations, significant vessels, cargoes worth enormous sums, with minimal bloodshed. Merchant captains looked at him coming and concluded, almost universally, that resistance was irrational. They surrendered before the first shot was fired. This is not the biography of a sadist or a psychopath. This is the biography of a man who had thought extremely carefully about the economics of violence and arrived at a strategy of extraordinary efficiency. Terror as a business strategy. Think about the problem Blackbeard was trying to solve. He needed merchant captains to surrender their ships and cargoes with as little resistance as possible. Resistance meant combat. Combat meant casualties among his own crew, among the merchant crew, damage to the captured ship, time lost, risk of intervention by naval vessels. The simplest solution was to make resistance seem completely pointless before it began. If the merchant captain looked at the approaching ship and its captain and concluded that fighting was suicide, he would surrender without firing a shot. No casualties, no damaged cargo, no wasted time. The burning fuses were not vanity. They were a calculated tool of psychological warfare, deployed against men who were already frightened, designed to tip them from frightened to completely convinced that resistance was impossible. The theatrical ferocity, the terrifying appearance, the reputation carefully cultivated and allowed to outrun reality, was the cheapest possible way to take a ship. Blackbeard was, in a specific and precise sense, a pirate intellectual, a man who understood that the perception of violence could substitute for its reality, and that managing that perception was the most valuable skill a pirate captain could have. There is a documented account of Blackbeard during a blockade of Charleston, South Carolina, a period when he effectively held a major colonial port hostage, sitting across from negotiating officials and behaving with complete composure and politeness. The terrifying figure from the ships, the man with fire in his beard, was discussing terms calmly and getting exactly what he wanted because everyone at the table remembered what he looked like when he wasn't being polite. Blackbeard within the Nassau community. What is less understood about Blackbeard, what gets almost entirely lost in the mythologized version, is the degree to which he was a product of Nassau's specific political culture, rather than simply a colorful personality who happened to end up there. Blackbeard did not operate in isolation. He corresponded with other Nassau captains. He participated in the informal governance structures of the Republic. He coordinated operations with other ships. He was, for a significant portion of his career, part of something larger than himself, a member of a community with shared interests, shared protocols, and shared principles. He was also, by the evidence, genuinely committed to the Nassau model of crew governance. His articles, so far as they survive, reflect the same democratic principles as the broader Nassau community. The crew voted. The quartermaster managed distribution. Men were compensated for injuries. He was not a lone wolf genius. He was a highly effective operator within a collective system that made his effectiveness possible. This matters because it changes the story. The story we usually tell about Blackbeard is the story of an individual, a singular, larger-than-life character whose outsized personality drove his success. The actual story is about what a community makes possible. Nassau gave Blackbeard the network, the intelligence, the supply chains, the safe harbor, and the political culture that made his strategy viable. Without Nassau, Blackbeard is just a violent man in a boat. The death of Edward Teach. Blackbeard was dead by November 1718. He was killed in a confrontation with Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, off the coast of North Carolina in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet. The account of his death in contemporary sources is so theatrical it reads like something his own reputation generated. He reportedly took 5 musket balls and 20 sword wounds before going down. Whether this precise count is accurate or embellishment is impossible to determine at this distance. What the record does make clear is that he continued fighting through injuries that should have killed him several times over, which is either testament to remarkable physical toughness or testament to the mythologizing that was already operating in real time. What the record also makes clear is that he was hunted specifically, that the operation to find and kill him was ordered from London, personally authorized at a high level of the British government, and executed with urgency. This tells us something important about how the British government classified Edward Teach, not as a criminal to be arrested and tried, as a symbol to be destroyed before it could be martyred. The speed and determination of the operation to kill Blackbeard suggests that London had concluded, correctly, that a living Blackbeard was more dangerous than a dead one. The dead man could be presented as evidence that the Republic was over. The living man, tried in a public court, given a platform, allowed to speak. That was a different and more frightening thing entirely. Nassau was not Blackbeard and it was not Hornigold. It was a community of hundreds of captains, thousands of sailors, and a small number of figures whose stories have survived the centuries in enough detail to tell us something about what the Republic actually was in practice. Charles Vane, the true believer. Charles Vane was one of the most aggressive of the Nassau captains, and one of the most politically committed to Nassau's independence. Where Hornigold retained an English loyalty that eventually led him to accept a pardon and become a pirate hunter, and where Blackbeard maintained a pragmatic flexibility about his relationship with authority, Vane was something closer to a true believer. He understood what Nassau was in a way that most of his contemporaries did not articulate, or could not articulate, because Nassau had no political philosophy, only practices. But Vane seems to have grasped intuitively that the Republic's value was not in the money it generated or even in the freedom it represented, but in the proof it provided. That people at the bottom of every legitimate hierarchy could build something durable and functional and militarily formidable without the permission of anyone above them. When Woodes Rogers arrived with the offer of a royal pardon, Vane was the most vociferous opponent of acceptance. Not because he was reckless or didn't understand the danger. He understood the danger perfectly. Because he understood that accepting the pardon meant accepting the legitimacy of the power that was offering it. And that concession, once made, would unravel everything Nassau had built. He was right, and he lost the argument anyway. Vane sailed out of Nassau harbor firing his cannon at Rogers' fleet, the last dramatic gesture of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle and decided to fight it anyway. He was captured in 1720, tried in Jamaica, and hanged. He was right about what the pardon meant. He was wrong about whether refusing it could save the Republic. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, what equality actually meant. Anne Bonny left her husband, a legitimate legal marriage, a respectable colonial life in Nassau, for John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, and joined his crew. Mary Read arrived at Rackham's ship disguised as a man, was discovered to be a woman, and remained with the crew on equal terms. Both women fought alongside male crew members and were described in contemporary accounts as more ferocious in combat than most of the men aboard. The question worth dwelling on is not whether these women were extraordinary, they clearly were. The question is why Nassau was the place where their presence was possible. Why, in an Atlantic world that defined women as property, legally, economically, and socially, was there a community where women could fight, vote, earn shares, and exist as functional equals? The answer is the Articles. Nassau's foundational principle was not philosophical, it was contractual. You signed the Articles, you got a vote and a share. The Articles, so far as we know, did not specify gender. They specified obligation and contribution. And a woman who contributed, who fought, who worked, who held up her end of the ship's operations, had fulfilled the terms of the contract. Neither Bonny nor Read were exceptional within Nassau's community. They were expressions of it. Nassau's democracy was imperfect and often brutal. But it was, by the standards of 1716, shockingly inclusive, not because of ideology, but because its organizing principle was the most radical possible application of practical equality. If you are here and you contribute, you belong. Rackham was captured in 1720, tried in Jamaica, and hanged. Both Bonny and Read were captured with him. Read died in prison before sentence could be carried out, cause uncertain. Bonny's fate after her trial is genuinely unknown. The historical record simply stops. She appears at her trial, receives her sentence, and vanishes. Whether she escaped, was pardoned through family influence, died in prison, nobody knows. The Republic's most famous woman exits history through a door that no surviving document opens. A democracy of 1,000 egos is hard to maintain. This is not an original observation. The Athenians noted it, the Roman Republicans noted it. Every democratic experiment in history has run into the same fundamental problem. Democracy is expensive. It is slow. It requires negotiation and compromise and the tolerance of people you disagree with. Hierarchy is fast and efficient and asks very little of anyone except obedience. Nassau's democracy was also under specific material pressures that pure political theory does not capture. The Caribbean was getting more dangerous. The naval presence of England and Spain and the Netherlands was increasing as the great powers recognized, belatedly, the scale of what had developed in the Bahamas. Supply was getting harder to maintain. The merchant networks that had quietly supplied Nassau with food and rope and gunpowder were being pressured by colonial authorities. And the Republic had no ideology. This is the crucial vulnerability that its enemies could exploit and that the Republic could not defend against. Nassau had practices, articles, customs, a functional culture of rough equality, but it had no articulated vision of what it was trying to become. No framework for extending its principles beyond the immediate community of those who had signed the articles. No political language for refusing the empire's offer of individual safety in the name of collective survival. The king's pardon, calculated fracture. King George I issued the Act of Grace in 1717, offering full pardon to any pirate who surrendered before September 5th of that year. This was not mercy. It was a precisely calculated political operation designed to do exactly one thing: fracture the Nassau community. The pardon offered individual exit. If you accepted it, you were safe, provided you gave up everything Nassau had built. The offer was deliberately structured to be attractive to the individual and destructive to the collective. It said, in effect, you personally can survive this. All you have to do is abandon the experiment. And because Nassau had no ideology, no shared language for why the experiment mattered more than personal survival, the community split. Some accepted, some refused. The debate itself, conducted through Nassau's democratic processes right up to the end, is the most Nassau thing that Nassau ever did. Woodes Rogers and the end. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a Royal Navy escort, the authority of a commission as governor of the Bahamas, and a very clear mandate: end the Republic. He found the harbor defended. Vane's fleet was there, armed and hostile. The community had debated collectively whether to resist. Some had voted for acceptance. Some had voted for resistance. They voted, they disagreed. The Republic held its last democratic proceeding, and then, as democracies sometimes do, chose the path that ended it. Vane fired his cannon and sailed out of the harbor. The others watched him go and made their individual calculations. Hornigold, the founder, the man who had built the flying gang, accepted the pardon and became a pirate hunter. He used his knowledge of Nassau's networks, its captains and their habits and their favored routes, with devastating effectiveness. He died in a shipwreck in 1719, which is perhaps the cleanest possible exit from the moral complexity of his last years. By 1720, Nassau was over. The harbor that had sheltered 1,000 pirates was under British administration. The captains were dead or pardoned and converted into instruments of their former enemies. The articles were dissolved. The democracy of Nassau, which had operated continuously for approximately 6 years, and had functioned as the most radical experiment in collective self-governance that the Atlantic world had yet seen, was dismantled so efficiently that most of the people living through it probably didn't fully register what had been lost. There is a tempting story to tell here, a clean, satisfying story about how Nassau's democratic experiment directly influenced the American and French revolutions 60 years later. It would be a good story. It would also be false. The intellectual genealogy does not connect cleanly. Jefferson did not read Nassau's articles. Robespierre was not inspired by pirate quartermasters. The revolutions of the late 18th century drew on philosophical traditions, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, that developed independently of anything that happened in the Bahamas. The Nassau legacy is not genealogical. It is something stranger and more interesting. What Nassau demonstrated, empirically, not theoretically, is that authority does not have to descend from above. That a community of poor, uneducated, multiply-dispossessed people could build a functioning governance structure without a king, without a parliament, without the permission of any established power. That the most radical political idea of the Enlightenment, the idea that legitimate authority derives from the consent of the governed, was not just a philosophical proposition. It was a practical possibility. Nassau proved this in the hardest possible way, by doing it, and then by defending it militarily against the most powerful naval forces in the world for 5 years. The Board of Trade reports from this period keep reaching for the right word and not quite finding it. Nassau is described as a nest of pirates, accurate but insufficient, as a threat to commerce, true but understated, as a dangerous example, which is the closest the official language gets to what actually worried them. The dangerous example problem was this. Nassau demonstrated that a community of poor people could organize themselves without a king, sustain themselves through collective action, and successfully resist the most powerful naval forces in the world for years. This was information that the ruling class of Europe did not want widely distributed, not because they believed the pirates were philosophers. Because they could see, in the economic disruption Nassau was causing, and the manpower it was attracting from legitimate employment, the outlines of a contagion. Ideas spread. The idea that you could sign an article instead of obeying a king, that this was not just something pirates did in Nassau but something any group of people could do anywhere, that idea was genuinely dangerous. It had to be suppressed, and the most effective way to suppress it was not military. The military suppression was straightforward. The most effective suppression was narrative. Tell the Nassau story as an adventure. Tell it as romance. Tell it as the Golden Age of Piracy, full of treasure and swashbuckling and colorful characters in tricorn hats. Drain it of its political content so completely that the people retelling it don't even notice there was political content to drain. That suppression has lasted 300 years. It has worked perfectly. The harbor is still there. The approaches are still shallow. The fort that Rogers rebuilt on the ruins of the original is still standing, though it serves different purposes now. Nassau is a city, a capital, a tourist destination. The ships that come in now are cruise liners and yachts and the occasional naval vessel on a courtesy visit. The Republic lasted 6 years. It governed itself under articles drafted by men who had never read a philosophy book and who arrived at democratic governance through the practical logic of survival. It built the most equitable economic system in the Atlantic world, imperfect, brutal in its own ways, morally compromised by its relationship with slavery, but more equal than anything the legitimate powers of the era had managed to construct. It attracted the poor, the conscripted, the formerly enslaved, the women who had been defined as property, the men who had been pressed into service they never chose. It offered them a vote and a share and a contract. It asked them to sign the articles and contribute, and it kept its end of the bargain. And when the empire came to end it, the Republic held one last democratic proceeding. It debated, it voted, it disagreed, it made its decision, and then it dissolved, not conquered from outside, but concluded from within by the same process of collective decision-making that had built it. That is not a pirate story. That is a story about what human beings are capable of building when they are desperate and free, and no one is watching. It is a story about the gap between the world as it is arranged and the world as it could be arranged. It is a story about what gets called criminality when power wants to discredit an idea. Nassau was not utopia, but it was proof, and proof is the most dangerous thing in the world. The forgetting has lasted 300 years. That ends today.